2 days after Jason's slow-rolling surveillance run, the HOA finally made the bold public move I'd been expecting. But even I wasn't prepared for just how far they were willing to go. I was repairing the herbicide-damaged soil near the path when I heard the unmistakable sound of engines, multiple engines, thundering down the road. When I stepped on the porch, what I saw made my stomach clench. The HOA had brought an entire crew this time. Not just Martin and his usual band of enforcers, but nearly a dozen men, clipboard carriers, measuring tape guys, a landscaper crew in neon vests, and even a man in a bright orange hard hat who looked like he belonged on a construction site, not an HOA inspection. They parked all along the shoulder like they were staging a county operation. As they approached, spreading across my front yard like an invading force, Martin stepped forward with his swagger I hadn't seen since before the deputy shut him down. He lifted a megaphone, yes, a full megaphone, and declared loudly enough for half the valley to hear, "We're beginning mandatory compliance corrections for safety and uniformity violations." The absurdity almost made me laugh, but anger rose instead. Behind him, Jason was filming, sweeping his camera across my property like he was shooting some expose documentary. Meanwhile, the neon-vested men were already unloading tools, shovels, rigs, line markers, paint guns, and walking straight toward my fence and shed. I blocked their path immediately, planting myself between them and my property line, telling them they had no legal right to be here. Martin stepped close, lifting a thick stack of papers and waving them inches from my chest. "These are authorized correction orders," he said. But the documents were clearly fake. HOA letterheads printed on cheap paper, filled with pseudo-legal jargon and signatures from board members who had zero power beyond their own subdivision. When I told them to leave, Martin gave the order I'd been dreading: begin boundary redefinition. In seconds, the neon-vested men fanned out along the fence line, pulling out spray paint and marking large, bright orange lines across the ground, lines several feet inside my property. One man even started measuring the side of my shed like he was preparing it for demolition. The sheer violation hit like a punch. I shouted for them to stop, and when they ignored me, I reached for my phone to call Officer Briggs again. That's when one of the landscaper guys tried to step past me toward the shed. I moved in front of him, and he backed off, looking unsure, but the tension was already rising like a boiling pot. Martin yelled, "Obstruction will be documented as non-compliance," while Jason zoomed in like he expected me to lose control. But I didn't. I kept my voice steady as I told every man there they were trespassing and that the sheriff was already on his way. Even then, they didn't stop. The neon vest guys kept spraying orange boundaries, the hard hat guy kept shouting measurements, and Martin kept barking orders that had no legal authority whatsoever. They wanted a confrontation. They wanted footage. They wanted leverage. But what they didn't know was that Officer Briggs wasn't the only backup I'd called. There was someone else already on the way, someone who knew land law even better than they did, and who wasn't afraid to shut down an entire group of overreaching board members. And when that backup arrived, the HOA's entire stunt collapsed spectacularly, sparking the showdown that would shift the whole battle in my favor. The next morning, I woke up to the kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. I brewed coffee, stepped onto my porch, and scanned the tree line, half expecting to see Alex or Marcus lurking with another camera, but instead I saw a pickup truck I didn't recognize rolling slowly up the gravel road. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but something about the careful way it approached made every instinct in my body tighten like a coiled spring. The truck stopped 20 feet from my gate, and out stepped a tall, older guy wearing faded jeans, a worn leather jacket, and the kind of calm expression that told me he wasn't here to start a fight, but he was definitely here for serious business. He introduced himself as Raymond, the HOA's former chairman, and the moment he said former, I understood why he looked like a man carrying old ghosts. He explained that he had resigned 2 years ago after discovering what he called a different agenda brewing among the board. An agenda run by Alex, Marcus, and even the new treasurer, Nolan, each of them using the HOA not to maintain order, but to bully homeowners, manipulate dues, and intimidate anyone who questioned them. His voice stayed level, but I could see tension in his jaw as he talked. He wasn't proud to be connected to them, even in history. Then he said the real reason he'd come. He'd heard about the confrontation on my property, and he believed the new board was planning something bigger, something coordinated, something that didn't involve giving me a chance to defend myself. He warned me that these guys had developed a pattern: create chaos, push the homeowner into reacting, then file legal complaints blaming the owner for aggression toward HOA volunteers. It was a setup they had used 3 times before, and in every case, the homeowner moved out within months under threat of endless fees and lawsuits. I stood there gripping my mug, heat seeping into my fists, trying to decide whether to feel angry or impressed. These men weren't just bullies, they were strategists. But Raymond wasn't finished. He said he kept records, copies of board emails, meeting notes, financial inconsistencies, and something else that made my pulse spike: documented evidence that the HOA had intentionally trespassed on 3 properties earlier this year while pretending to perform compliance checks. The same play they attempted on my land. Raymond didn't want power back. He wanted justice, and he needed someone stubborn enough not to roll over the way others had, someone willing to take these guys on openly. And apparently, after seeing the way I handled a midnight ambush on my own property, he figured I was that guy. I listened quietly, weighing everything, tracing back every event from the moment Alex stepped onto my gravel road to the moment I raised my shotgun in the shadows. Now it was clear, this was never about grass height, fencing, or boundary markers. This was a power game, and I'd just been drafted into a war I didn't start. Raymond asked if I was prepared to push back. Not with violence, but with strategy, documentation, and exposure. I didn't answer right away because I could feel a shift in the air, like trouble was closer than either of us realized. And as he got back into his truck, I noticed a second vehicle hidden far down the road, watching us, engine running. Something told me the HOA wasn't waiting for paperwork. They were already making their next move. But I had no idea that their next move would hit harder than anything they had done so far. That evening, long after Raymond's truck disappeared down the road, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of documents he'd left behind. Emails, meeting logs, and photocopies of financial reports full of red flags so bright they practically glowed through the paper. The more I read, the clearer the pattern became. The HOA wasn't just overstepping. They were running an organized racket. Inflated maintenance fees, unrecorded cash payments, and falsified inspection reports all pointed to a board that had stopped functioning like a community association and started operating like a small-time syndicate. Every page tightened a knot in my chest. This wasn't going to end with a simple complaint or a calm conversation. These men would fight tooth and nail to protect what they'd built. I was so focused on the documents that at first I didn't hear the crunch of footsteps outside. Soft, deliberate, like someone trying not to be noticed. My hand hovered near the drawer where I kept my shotgun, instincts flaring. I turned off the kitchen light, moved silently to the window, and peeked through a slit in the blinds. 3 silhouettes stood at the edge of my yard, one tall, one stocky, one fidgeting nervously. I recognized the stocky one immediately. Marcus. The other 2 were likely men I hadn't met yet, probably new muscle for the board. They weren't talking. They weren't walking toward the door. They were just standing there, watching my house like hunters tracking movement. I stepped quietly to the back door, grabbed my flashlight, and flicked it on in a sharp beam. The moment the light cut through the dark, the men flinched, and one of them, maybe the tall one, pointed at my house before urging the others to fall back. They hurried down the drive, not running, but pulling back fast enough to signal one thing. They weren't here to intimidate me. They were scouting. That was worse. A chill settled deep in my spine. I set the documents aside, grabbed my boots, and headed outside. Even in the cold night air, their footprints were fresh in the gravel, and I followed them to the corner of my property line where I found something that made my jaw clench. A small, camouflaged motion sensor. Not the kind hunters used, the kind used for surveillance. Someone had planted it on my land. Someone wanted to know when I was home, when I wasn't, and when I moved around. I pocketed the device, turned off the flashlight, and walked back toward the house, feeling the weight of the situation in a way I hadn't before. This wasn't a feud anymore. It was an operation. As I reached my porch, I noticed the slip of paper wedged under the step. I unfolded it and read the message, handwritten, shaky, like the writer was in a hurry. They don't want to scare you. They want you off the property before the audit. No name, no signature, no explanation, just a warning that landed like a punch to the gut. The HOA wasn't panicking because I had a shotgun. They were panicking because I had evidence. And if they were setting up surveillance, scouting teams, and anonymous warnings, then whatever audit was coming must have been big enough to blow their entire scheme wide open. But I didn't know then that the audit wasn't the only thing they were trying to erase, because their next step targeted something far more personal. The next morning, before the sun had even burned off the fog, I stepped outside to check the perimeter of my property again. Yesterday's discoveries had left me wired, alert, and bracing for whatever the HOA might attempt next. What I didn't expect, though, was the scorched smell drifting faintly across the breeze. Subtle at first, then unmistakably sharp like burnt plastic mixed with heated metal. My stomach tightened. I followed the smell to the side of my workshop, and the sight that hit me stopped me cold. My utility ATV, the same one I used to haul lumber, tools, and supplies across the acreage, was charred along one side. Its seat melted, wiring exposed, and several panels warped from heat. Someone had tried to set it on fire. Not fully burning it, not destroying it outright, just enough to send a warning that they could. I crouched beside it, inspecting the damage, and found the remnants of a small ignition device tucked behind the wheel well. Amateur, but intentional. And the message was clear. They were escalating. I stood up, fists clenching, anger rising like a tide I had to force myself not to drown in. This wasn't just trespassing or surveillance anymore. This was sabotage. This was criminal. I grabbed my phone, intending to call the sheriff, but something in me hesitated. Not out of fear, out of strategy. If I called too early, with too little proof, the HOA would spin the story, twist it, and claim I'd staged the damage myself to create drama. Raymond had warned me. These men were experts at flipping narratives. So instead, I documented everything. Photos from every angle, close-ups, a video walkthrough, timestamps. Then I went back inside, pulled out the documents Raymond gave me, and started piecing together a timeline. The sabotage meant they were desperate. Desperate people make mistakes, and mistakes leave trails. As I spread everything across the dining table, a pattern started to form. Each homeowner targeted before me had their property damaged right before the audit. Broken lights, slashed tires, vandalized mailboxes, all small enough to argue about, but disruptive enough to push them into conflict. The HOA would then report that the homeowner had become aggressive following the damage, filing complaints and creating a paper trail that made the owner look unstable. It was a manufactured pattern, one they needed me to fall into. But unlike the others, I wasn't reacting the way they expected. They wanted me furious. They wanted me reckless. They wanted an excuse. Instead, I was methodical, calculating and documenting every move they made. And then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. 4 words. Check your mailbox now. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my jacket, stepped outside, and walked down the gravel path toward the road. The mailbox stood there like it always did. Ordinary, quiet, harmless. But when I opened it, my blood ran cold. Inside was a printed photo of me, taken the night those men stood on the edge of my yard. The angle was close,
Too close. It meant someone had been nearer than I realized, close enough to capture my face lit by the flashlight beam. And underneath the photo was a short typed message. "Next time, we won't just watch." I started the message, feeling the gravity of it settle in my chest. They weren't hiding anymore. They weren't pretending. They were announcing the storm. And that storm was about to break in a way none of us could have predicted. Not even me.
I carried the photo and the typed message back to the house with a steadiness that didn't match the adrenaline pounding through my veins. Inside, I set the picture on the table beside the scattered documents and stared at it for a long moment. The angle bothered me because it wasn't taken from the road, the tree line, or any natural vantage point. It was taken from inside my property, probably just 30 or 40 feet from where I stood that night. Someone had crept in closer than I realized. Someone had been watching me long before I noticed the silhouettes at the edge of the yard. That thought settled deep, stirring anger and caution in equal measure. I was done reacting. It was time to flip the script. I pulled out a notebook and started making a list. Times, locations, faces, vehicles, every detail from the past week, every trespass, every threat, every piece of evidence Raymond had given me. If they wanted to warp documentation, I would drown them in it. I was halfway through writing when a vehicle rumbled up the road. Fast, too fast for someone just passing by. I looked out the window and spotted a white HOA branded pickup skidding to a stop directly in front of my gate. Out stepped Nolan, the treasurer, the money man, the quiet one who rarely appeared at the confrontations. That alone made his sudden arrival suspicious. He adjusted his glasses, straightened his spotless jacket, and stood there like he was preparing to give a press conference. I walked out to meet him, not opening the gate, but standing just inside my property line. He forced a smile, the kind that didn't touch his eyes. It began with a rehearsed speech about community safety, recent misunderstandings, and a concerning escalation that he believed we could resolve peacefully. And letting ramble, watching his body language. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to probe, to see how much I knew, to gauge whether I was intimidated. When he finally paused, I asked him one question. Is this about the audit? For a split second, just a fraction, something in his eyes twitched. That was all the answer I needed. His smile faltered, then snapped back into place, but the damage was done. He shifted tone, insisting the HOA wanted cooperation, that they expected full compliance with upcoming inspections, and that failure to cooperate could result in fines or legal action. By then, I was done pretending. I walked closer to the gate, held up the photo they'd planted in my mailbox, and stared Nolan dead in the eye. You need to tell your board that if any of you step foot on my property again, I won't just defend myself, I'll expose everything. His face drained of color. He didn't take the photo. He didn't deny it. He just swallowed hard, nodded stiffly, and hurried back to the truck like a man who suddenly realized the ground beneath him was cracking. I watched him speed away, gravel spraying behind him, but the uneasy feeling didn't fade. If the treasurer himself came to test the waters, that meant the audit was closer than I'd been told, and the board was scrambling in panic. And when desperate men see their scheme collapsing, they don't calm down, they explode. And I was about to find out just how far they'd go when cornered, because their next attack wasn't on my property. It was on someone who tried to help me. I didn't have to wait long to find out how far the HOA was willing to go. Late that afternoon, while I was sorting the evidence files into a binder ready for the upcoming audit, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something in my gut pushed me to answer. The moment I did, all I heard was heavy breathing, ragged, strained, and then a familiar voice struggling to speak. It was Raymond. His words were slurred, uneven, like someone had knocked the wind out of him. He told me he needed help, that something had happened near the old community storage lot the HOA controlled. Before I could ask anything else, he groaned in pain and the call cut off. I grabbed my keys, partly driven by instinct,
partly by the realization that if the HOA wanted to scare me, the best way wasn't by burning my ATV or planting cameras. It was by hurting the only ally I had. The storage lot sat at the edge of the community, overgrown with weeds and surrounded by rusting fences that hadn't seen a repair in a decade. As I pulled up, I spotted Raymond's old blue truck tilted awkwardly near the fence, the driver's door wide open. The air was thick with tension, like the whole place was holding its breath. I got out quietly, scanning the lot. At first, I didn't see him, but then I noticed a shape slumped against one of the storage units. I rushed over and found Raymond sitting on the ground, clutching his ribs, his jacket torn and dirt smeared across his face. Someone had roughed him up badly, too badly for this to be some random incident. When he looked up at me, I saw fear in his eyes, a fear that wasn't there when he'd warned me about the board. He told me 3 men, he couldn't see their faces clearly, cornered him after he left a supply store in town. They didn't steal anything, they just beat him, shoved him into his truck, and told him to stay quiet about old business. Old business? The audit files, the past financial records, the buried corruption he'd kept copies of. I felt my jaw tighten. They weren't just after me. They were trying to erase the loose ends. Every witness, every document, every person who could expose the truth. Raymond gripped my arm and told me he had something I needed to see. He pointed toward the back of the storage lot, where a newer padlock hung awkwardly on a unit that looked almost untouched compared to the others. He whispered that the HOA had been using it as a private archive, keeping original logs, financial sheets, and, most importantly, unaltered inspection records. Records that would destroy everything the board had built their scheme on. My pulse kicked up. This was bigger than I thought. I helped Raymond stand and moved him to his truck, making sure he was steady enough to drive home after resting a while. But as I turned back toward the storage unit, something else caught my eye. A set of fresh boot prints leading away from the lot, deep enough to show they'd been made recently. Whoever attacked Raymond had been here moments before I arrived. Maybe they'd even seen me drive up. A chill traced my spine. They weren't trying to hide their tracks anymore. This was open war, and when I finally opened that storage unit, what I found inside didn't just confirm the corruption, it revealed a betrayal that hit far closer than I ever imagined.
I waited until Raymond's truck disappeared safely down the road before turning back to that storage unit, the one with the newer padlock hanging like a silent dare. The air around it felt different, still, heavy, as if the entire HOA's corruption was sealed behind that thin metal door, waiting to breathe. I slipped on gloves, more out of caution than fear, and examined the lock. It wasn't professionally installed. Cheap hardware, hastily secured, and scratched like someone had opened it in a hurry. Using a pry bar I kept in the back of my truck, it took less than a minute to snap it loose. The lock clattered to the concrete, loud enough to echo through the empty lot, but no one came. Slowly, I rolled up the door, bracing myself for boxes or papers, but what greeted me first was the smell. Damp cardboard, mildew, and the unmistakable scent of old paper aging in stagnant air. Stacks of binders lined both sides, some labeled Financial Review 2021, Board Minutes Confidential, and others with no labels at all. But there was one crate on a metal shelf, locked with a small latch, that caught my attention immediately because it had a tag on it with a single initial. R. Raymond. My pulse quickened. I cracked the latch and opened the crate. Inside were 2 items. A thick envelope stuffed with documents, and a small USB drive taped to the top. The envelope contained copies of what looked like original financial ledgers, handwritten, unedited, nothing like the versions Raymond had given me earlier. These showed massive discrepancies, thousands of dollars in maintenance projects that never happened, payments to shell companies with no addresses, forged signatures of former board members. It was enough to take down the entire HOA. But what froze me wasn't the corruption. It was the folder buried at the bottom of the crate. The tab read, Complaint Records Pre-Incident. I opened it and felt the floor drop out from under me. Inside were detailed logs written by none other than Alex, describing me months before I'd ever moved in. He had notes on my previous property, photos of my old house, even a list of dates when I'd attended town meetings. He knew who I was long before the first bogus violation notice. And that wasn't all. The final page was a printed email between Alex and Nolan, dated before I had purchased the land. New buyer's a problem. Background suggests he doesn't tolerate pressure. Strong personality. We'll keep him contained. Contained. They'd targeted me. Before I even set foot in this neighborhood, they had planned to break me down, push me out, or use me as an example. My blood ran hot. My hands tightened around the folder until the paper creaked. This wasn't harassment. This wasn't miscommunication. This was a deliberate operation, a premeditated campaign to intimidate and control homeowners they couldn't manipulate. And I had been handpicked. Rage simmered deep in my chest. But before I could process the full weight of that betrayal, I heard something. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. The kind of footsteps made by someone who wasn't afraid to be heard. Someone who knew exactly where I was. I lowered the folder, stepped back from the crate, and reached instinctively for the tool handle sticking from my truck. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside the open unit. I exhaled once, bracing myself, because the man who stepped into the doorway wasn't one of the thugs. It was someone I never imagined would stand against me. When the figure finally stepped into the doorway, the dim gray light of the storage lot revealed a face I knew far too well. Sheriff Dalton. The same lawman who'd shrugged off my first complaint and dismissed the HOA's nighttime trespassers as neighborhood misunderstandings. But now he wasn't wearing his usual calm, polite expression. His jaw was tight, his eyes cold, and his hand hovered near his holster, not gripping it, but close enough to send a clear message. He wasn't here as a neutral party. He looked around the storage unit slowly, taking in the open crates, the spread of incriminating documents, the broken lock, and finally me, standing in the center of all of it. "You've been busy," he said, voice low, measured in a way that instantly felt wrong, not cautious, calculated. I straightened, keeping my hands visible, not because I feared him, but because I refused to give him any excuse to twist the situation. "What are you doing out here?" I asked. "This lot isn't public." Dalton stepped inside, boots crunching gravel, and gestured lazily toward the rows of documents. "Funny thing," he said. "No one called earlier. Said you were stirring up trouble, breaking into association property, threatening board members." His gaze locked onto mine, sharp and probing. He wants to press charges. A wave of anger rose in my chest, but underneath it was cold clarity. This was the HOA's endgame. If they got the sheriff on their side, especially one already conditioned to take their word over mine, they could crush the audit, bury the evidence, and frame me as the aggressor. But as Dalton walked deeper into the unit, his expression cracked, just a little, enough for me to see something else beneath the practice authority. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. I followed his gaze as it drifted to the crate labeled R, to the financial ledgers, the forged signatures, the surveillance notes, the folder documenting how Alex had targeted me months before I moved in. Dalton's breath hitched almost imperceptibly. Something about this wasn't new to him. Something here he recognized. And then it clicked. Raymond had mentioned once, just in passing, that the old HOA chairman had clashed with the local authorities before stepping down. Local authorities, as in the sheriff's office, as in Dalton. I realized it then. The HOA wasn't just bribing people. They were blackmailing them. And judging by the rigid tension in Dalton's shoulders, I was looking at a man who'd been caught in their web for years, maybe forced into cooperation, maybe threatened with exposure of his own mistakes. He wasn't here to arrest me. He was here to see how much danger he was in. I picked up one of the ledgers and held it out to him slowly. "Look at it. You know exactly what this means." He hesitated, then flipped through a few pages. His face paled. His throat bobbed with a hard swallow. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that shifted everything. I didn't know they kept all of this. Quiet, almost ashamed. He closed the ledger and stepped back, eyes darting toward the exit, mind clearly racing. Then he pointed at the crates. Pack it all, he said, whispering. Every page, every drive, every record. You take it and get ready. I stared at him, stunned. For what? Dalton met my eyes with a look that chilled the air between us. For when this blows open, he said. The HOA isn't going to come for your property anymore. They're going to come for you. He stepped backwards into the daylight, and you better hit back harder than they ever expected. Then he walked away, leaving me alone with the truth, the evidence, and the storm that was finally about to break.